they want college-educated wives. They want equals in their marriages, don't they? That's what I see in the evidence.
So let's talk about this. There's two things going on here. Number one, when we talk about a social contract, like a Magna Carta, one of the things that happens is we didn't want teenage pregnancy. We didn't want so much violence. And in doing so, while I believe the lowering of the amount of violence, I grew up in Texas in the 1990s during a crack epidemic. Wow. The level of violence was just untenable, right? Though at one point the murder capital of the U.S. was Oak Cliff, Texas. At one point it was Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Like, it was horrible. Now, what happened during those times is we wanted less violence, and as a result, now boys don't get into fights in high school like we did. I look back at that time and I'm like, well, when there's a difficult time coming, because I've done difficult things, I can deal with it better. And now my son, who will have never been in a fight in his whole life, probably, he's not going to be able to deal with those things the same way. And as a result, you use the word pussies. I would not use that word, but like, that's essentially what's going on, is that we've made this social contract. Another part of the social contract is the idea of where women were not earning as much and now they're earning a lot more. And from a societal standpoint, who knows? A woman may cure cancer. The point is, from an economic standpoint, that's good. What his point is, though, that doesn't make us now want to marry her because she's got a master's degree and a PhD. And so we've got this, what Dr. Buss would call like an evolutionary mismatch, where we're going to have women who make $300,000 a year wait until they're their mid-30s to get married, and then they're like, where are all the good guys? Because that's the problem that they're having.
That's the survey evidence you quoted earlier from Daniel Cox actually shows that there's very high expectations that college-educated women have of men, much higher expectations.
Yes.
And that half of them are saying the reason they're single is because they cannot find a man who meets their expectations.
And yet 40% of men are now attending college, and like 32% of them are graduating.
So the question is, what happens going forward? I'm reasonably confident that we're all just going to have to update our views of the world and what we're looking for in a mate, because that's the way the market's going to play out. So right now we're still figuring that out, but we're all going to have to change the way we think about this. But I got to tell you, like,
so that's the difficulty
when you say, like,
right there.
I would like a woman who's earning $300,000 a year and has a master's degree. Thank you very much. And I don't think I'm alone in that. And it's not just because of the money. It's because an accomplished, professional, intelligent, successful woman who's like killing it at whatever she's choosing to do, that's incredibly attractive, I think, to a lot of men. And probably to most men. There are very few men out there who don't want their daughters or their wives or their sisters to be very successful professionally and economically. They then want them to have the choice to be able to do what they want without those resources. But I think you're wrong if the suggestion of what you're saying is that, secretly, the guys out there, they just want women to be the way women were before.
No, it's not that. But the problem is, if you have a group of men, Bill Maher, he said this on one of his shows, is like, you have a group, you have these women where 60% of them are going to college, and I believe 68% of them are the graduation rate. If you have that issue, now you have a bunch of men without college degrees. Now you have a bunch of women with college degrees, and their dating pool are men without college degrees. Yes. Then what happens, the standard before was, he was this big, strong dude who could provide for me. Now it's like, I have a Glock. And I can protect myself.
And Bill Maher's done, actually, Scott Galloway and others have, and actually, a lot of people are worrying about this. I'm not as worried about this as they are. I'll tell you why I'm not as worried about this, because I think what's going to happen is that women are going to adjust their expectations of the educational credentials of their husbands. They're going to have to. Which
I agree with the second part, but not the first part.
But they won't. So I think about my own family, right? In my own family, I have someone. She's a nurse. He's a plumber. Right. He's much less educated than her. He also makes a very good living. Are we going to see a world where nurses are going to refuse to marry plumbers just because they didn't get a 4-year degree? I don't think so.
I think we are. But the problem is when we survey, we have lots of women on here. There's other shows that have lots of women. It does not seem like, to get a woman to go on a dating app from 6 feet to 5'11" is like pulling teeth. Like, the idea that when we ask these women, what do you want as your minimum income for a wage earner, they're saying 170. That's the top 10% of wage earners in the United States. When we ask them about their age or their height or their income, they are not asking for less. And as a result, we're seeing twice as many single men as women. Who are these women dating? Older, successful men.
So there's this thing about, like, someone wrote this piece about you'd wait for Mr. Right. Now that you're waiting for Mr. Right, and it used to be like you'd like Mr. Good Enough, etc.
Yeah.
Well, but that height thing, I think there's a bad stat lurking out there, maybe in the manosphere, about this height thing, right? So I looked at this, which is whatever the percentages of women who say on these dating apps, like, I want a guy who's whatever, over 6 foot or something like that. But it's a bad stat because the denominator is of the women who said they had a height preference.
Sure.
And only a minority of women have a height preference.
That's interesting, yes. Selection bias, yeah.
So of the ones who say, I have a preference for height, they tend to say you want a taller guy. Well, duh, they're probably why they've said they have it. But only a minority of women click the thing saying, I have a preference for height. So you have to be really careful about these
who's
stats.
making the selection.
Yeah, who's making the selection. So it's massive selection bias of the women who care about height. Of the women who care about height, they tend to prefer their men taller. But, well, duh, but most women say they don't care about height.
But you're also basing that data on one statistic, which is like a Tinder dating profile. Whereas you can go and look at the work of, like, say, Dr. Rob Henderson or Steve Stewart Williams. When you look at, like, the preference for taller men across the board, then you have to take that.
Everything else equal. Totally agree. But everything else
should you go break your legs to make yourself taller? Probably not.
If you went to my wife and you said, look, don't keep everything about Richard exactly the same, but make him 5'6", right, as opposed to 6'2", would she go for that? No, she'd much rather I was 6'2". But she's had plenty of boyfriends and partners who are shorter, but they've had other things about them, right, that make it so.
Sure.
So it's one of these things that I think it's one of those facts that can almost be used against women sometimes, right? It's actually one of those things that sometimes it's like almost blaming women for the minority.
It's blaming women for their state.
It's the opposite of saying blaming men for actually having a preference for younger women.
5'8" and I'm never going to get laid.
Actually, essentially, Andrew Tate did a clip on this where someone asked him, they called into some show and they said, well, I'm short. I'm a short guy. I'm however tall. And I've said all this stuff. Women will only date kind of taller men. Sure. He said, first of all, that's not true, right? He said something similar to what I've just said. He said, second of all, you can't change that. These are the cards you've been dealt. Make the most of them. Get yourself in shape. Get yourself a career. Figure yourself. Do not use your height as an excuse
to cope.
Right. And I actually thought, solid advice, right? Because he could have gone the other way with that. He could have said, isn't it unfair how women prefer tall men and richer men? And it's like, it's the feminists. And that then gets into this incel psychology of victimhood, right? It's like, it's boo-hoo because all these women out there will only date like rich, tall, handsome men. And that's just
they're using for rationale.
They're rationalizing.
The point is, I agree with you. The thing we were saying, though, is when it came to their standards and we asked them, would you ever lower your standards? The answer was unequivocally no.
No.
Let's see. So I agree with you. In the first part, what we've seen before, though, is that when a woman, for instance, a preference for height, you're right. It's some women who have a preference for height.
Yes,
we've had women on here. But some women, we had CJ Sparks is a great example. Right. Looks were not important to her. The guy needed to make $1 million.
$5 million.
Yeah,
$5 million a year.
We had another girl on here. She dates male strippers. She makes tons of money as a real estate agent. She's only concerned with height and physical attractiveness. So the deviation for what women find attractive is much larger than what it is for men. And so when we see this kind of stuff, when we ask them, would you over time, when we show them the number of men making over $100,000 that are 6 feet tall, and it ends up being like 0.3% of men or some crazy number like that, would you then change your standards? Unequivocally, they say absolutely they will not, and they're going to beat the odds, and they're going to be the one to get the guy who's 6'3", who makes $500,000 a year, who's handsome, and they're not going to sell for anything else.
There's a very useful term in economics that would help us here, right? Which is the difference between preferences and revealed preferences.
Sure.
Which is what people actually do.
Yes.
Right. Here's what people say. Here's what they actually do.
Medium is the message.
And if you ask people, especially, that was a relatively small sample that you've just quoted, and maybe not a random sample of women, right? So you're going to get different answers. But then let's look at what people do. And so, like, we know that men on average are a little bit taller than women. We know there's lots of women who are kind of with shorter men, and they kind of figure it out. So let's see what people actually do rather than what they say. It's a bit like saying, like, men sometimes, I think, can convince themselves maybe that they're going to get like a very beautiful woman, say, right? That kind of sense of...
That's what they would prefer. That's what they would like.
Yeah.
That's what I've convinced myself of.
But actually, when it comes to it, right, other factors are going to bear...
They're mating opportunists.
Yeah, and they're just going to fall in love.